first thing, diabetes. What the heck is going on in diabetes? There's been, I think, an evolution of thought around the causes of diabetes and what is actually the sort of the crux of the physiological and metabolic abnormality and pathology. Explain to me, like, big picture, what is actually going on in insulin resistance and diabetes, and what is the crux of that metabolic abnormality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really is sort of the pinnacle of metabolic dysfunction. All roads along this metabolic dysfunction pathway lead to type 2 diabetes. And I classify this as sort of the type 2 diabetes spectrum. And on one side, on one end, you've got things like insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, which is slightly elevated blood sugar, high blood pressure, overweight, but not necessarily obese, dyslipidemia, so high cholesterol, high triglyceride levels. And then you start progressing down that pathway, and it can manifest in different ways. For example, PCOS, which is something that you don't necessarily directly associate with diabetes, I would put along that spectrum because it's part of that insulin resistance continuum. There's pre-diabetes, which is just sort of early diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And then there's other conditions along that spectrum that I would put, like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, which have been tied to insulin resistance. So it's a huge, huge thing. And some estimates say 7 to 8 out of 10 Americans have some sort of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. May not have prediabetes yet or type 2 diabetes, but are on their way. And
which is an interesting statistics when you consider that about that exact same percentage of the population is the percentage of people that are overweight or obese.
Exactly. And there is a large overlap, but not 100% overlap. So I'll talk about what type 2 diabetes isn't first. And it's not obesity. Obesity is a major comorbidity, as we say. So it goes with it often, something like 80% of the time. But there are people who are obese who don't have high blood sugar or prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And there are many people with type 2 diabetes who are normal weight or perhaps slightly overweight, and some who are underweight as well. So it's not the exact same as obesity. Again, they do oftentimes they're sort of cousins because they sort of have a common cause in most people, but and they can feed off of each other, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you said many people. I just want to get a sense of what the percentages look like. And my understanding is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is those two populations that you just mentioned, the insulin resistant or diabetic people who are not overweight necessarily, and the overweight people who are not insulin resistant or diabetic are more the exception than the rule. But
yeah, so
talk like specific.
Let's say it's 20. Let's say it's 20%.
Okay.
There's 100 million people in the U.S. right now with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So 20 million. That's just a rough estimate. Of course, I don't know that number specifically, but if we use some of the stats, 20% of 100 million is 20 million. So that's where the many people comes from.
Okay, that's 20 million between those two groups.
Between those two groups. And I tend to see more of those people, I think, because of the people who, try to search out for answers. They've already gone to their doctor. Their doctor doesn't understand why they have diabetes when they're normal weight. So they're looking for another opinion. So I tend to see probably 30% of my patients, clients fit into that category, but that is a little skewed high.
Interesting.
It's also not hyperglycemia. So oftentimes people think that diabetes and hyperglycemia are the same thing. And in fact, medically, most of the treatments for type 2 diabetes are in fact really treatments for hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia just means high blood sugar. But of course, there's many other things that can cause high blood sugar. You can go on a course of prednisone, for example, without having diabetes and end up with high blood sugar and never develop diabetes. So there are other things that cause hyperglycemia other than diabetes. So we can't confuse diabetes and high blood sugar and think they're the same thing. Because again, the problem there is if we believe that, then our treatment is all around lowering blood sugar, and we forget about the underlying root cause of why the blood sugar is high in the first place and what is underneath that and all the other sort of spider web myriad effects and consequences that come from the underlying cause.
Yeah, yeah, it does. So that's a perfect segue into what those root causes are. So what's the sort of big picture paradigm of the key, I don't know if you conceptualize it as the key 2 causes or the key 8 causes, but how would you paint that picture of what are the causes of insulin resistance and diabetes?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you said it that way because so we have type 2 diabetes and prediabetes and metabolic syndrome and PCOS and Alzheimer's disease in this continuum. Most of the time, again, nothing's 100%, but most of the time underneath those is both insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. So we have resistance to the hormone insulin, which helps us to regulate our blood sugar and other fuel. It's basically a storage hormone that helps us sack away excess energy for later use. And our bodies become resistant to that. We'll talk about some of the reasons why that happens in a minute, but we become resistant to that hormone. And then the next step, which is really what does a lot of the damage, is our pancreas then in turn starts overproducing insulin. So insulin resistance in and of itself is a problem, but the bigger problem is the hyperinsulinemia that comes from the insulin resistance. So the pancreas starts overproducing insulin, and now we've got all this extra insulin on board, which causes us to store fat in strange places. We store fat in our liver, in around the organs, intra-organ fat, visceral fat. We store it in the muscles. We store it just about everywhere because insulin just sort of opens that gate. Now, it's not going to do that. It's not as simple as I just made it seem. There's a lot more to it than that. But in the presence of extra energy, we'll say that if you're overeating, which most Americans do, unfortunately, especially with diabetes. So if you're overeating fat or overeating carbs or overeating both, which is usually the case, and you've got high insulin levels, the body's going to force all that extra energy into fat storage, and in places where you don't want fat storage oftentimes, because the subcutaneous fat, that fat around the belly or the legs and buttocks and so forth, will reach at some point a threshold, and then we start storing that fat other places.
Yeah.
So it's the insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemia, which then drives all kinds of problems. We said fat storage. Insulin acts on the kidneys to cause us to retain fluid and electrolytes. So our blood volume increases and our blood pressure increases, and we retain fluid. So a lot of people with hyperinsulinemia get swollen ankles, for example, and a puffy face and puffy hands, and they're very inflamed. Another thing that it does is degrades the endothelium of the blood vessels. So we get endothelial dysfunction, which can lead to oxidative stress and plaquing and atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease and stroke. So all of those things independently of what the blood sugar is doing. So you can have completely normal blood sugar and insulin resistance and elevated insulin, and it can still cause all these problems, including, as I mentioned earlier, Alzheimer's disease. A lot of the Alzheimer's disease research has found that people with insulin resistance, even with normal blood sugar, are at a much higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. So we have to separate the high blood sugar from the high insulin. Now, I'm not saying that high blood sugar is not an issue. It is. Once that blood sugar starts to rise, which is a little later down the line in the type 2 diabetes chain, so to speak, now it's compounded and we get all kinds of problems happening, which again we can get into if a little later if we want. But I want to answer your question, and I wanted to set that stage because to me that insulin resistance and high insulin is sort of the cause of the diabetes, of the pre-diabetes, of obesity many times, of PCOS, of Alzheimer's disease many times. But there are causes of that as well. So we have to go deeper and look at the cause of the cause.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect way of phrasing it. I'm glad you said that because I almost wanted to interrupt and add that earlier. But I just want to point out for a lot of people listening that a lot of the way people conceptualize causes depends on one's paradigm that they bring to the table. So if I would say the conventional medical paradigm is sort of like they stop basically where you just left off. So they've painted the picture of hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, some of these other biochemical metabolic abnormalities that you've spoken about here. And then they're conceptualizing those things as quote unquote the cause of diabetes. And therefore those are the things that we need to fix. And of course, since our philosophy and our paradigm revolves around sort of interruption of aberrant biochemical processes with pharmaceuticals, we need to develop a pharmaceutical or two to interrupt those quote unquote causes. Your paradigm, which I think is, in case it's not clear to people listening, I think is a much more intelligent and sophisticated paradigm, is to not stop there, but then to connect all of those biochemical abnormalities with the environment and lifestyle and nutrition habits at the true root cause level. And I think, we have to be careful with our use of language here, because I would say the only thing that we should be referring to as causes are really the things at the most root cause level possible.
Right. I totally agree. And the only reason I went through all that is because what a lot of these things cause is not the high blood sugar. They do in the long run, but they're directly associated with insulin resistance and high insulin levels. So we have to look at that as sort of that important go-between. But you're absolutely right. Most physicians, researchers go sort of one level deep. And, pharmaceutical targets will sometimes address that one level deep. There are, for example, a few diabetes drugs that address insulin resistance. Really only one that's used now, which is called metformin. But most of the diabetes drugs really only address the sign or the symptom, which is the high blood sugar. So certainly none of them really are addressing these root causes that we're going to get into. So, so there's many, and probably 10 or 12. Certainly, we can look at dietary factors. I think eating a sort of an unnatural diet. I'll just put it that way: a diet that's heavy in processed and refined foods, and whether that's processed refined grain products or refined sugars or refined processed industrial seed oils, what we call vegetable oils, which are pro-inflammatory and highly toxic. Whether we want to look at, just packaged foods and fake fats and so forth, all of this stuff, not to mention the chemicals that are added to these foods, can drive inflammation. And you're gonna hear me mention that word several times over the next few minutes, but inflammation is really one of the primary drivers of insulin resistance. So we see there's been several studies, for example, that show how a chronic systemic inflammatory process actually gums up the insulin receptors and blocks insulin from being able to interact with its receptor, almost like if you think of the key in the lock analogy. It's like the key can't open the lock. And inflammation does that. Now, here's another one. We could go another level deep on all the things that cause inflammation, and
Right.
I think we need to do that. But that's another sort of, factor that tends to drive this whole process. These foods, though, these fake foods, unnatural foods, so to speak, are one of the primary drivers of that inflammatory process. We don't move like we used to. And I think, even people who do exercise, a lot of times they'll go to a 1 hour exercise class and the rest of the day they're sitting, so they're sleeping all night. They wake up, they sit in the car, they sit in the office, they come home. Maybe they get an hour of exercise and then they sit on the couch and then they go back to bed. So it's like the body's not meant to do that. We're not designed that way. So unfortunately, that's a factor that is an important one, because there's so many important things that exercise does for the blood sugar regulation system, including driving glucose into the muscles to be burned for fuel, emptying our glycogen stores, which is the stored sugar in the liver and muscles that we then need to refill. We actually don't even need insulin when we're contracting muscles to soak up glucose into the muscle cells. Just the muscle contraction alone will allow glucose to get into the muscles, into the mitochondria and the muscles to be burned for fuel. So exercise is hugely important, not to mention cardiovascular health and circulation and lean muscle mass, which increases metabolic rate and so forth. So that's a big one.
Just what to add to that, I have seen at least one, if not two, maybe three studies. This is a few years back when I was digging into the literature on this, so I'm a little rusty, but at least one talking about measurable increases in insulin resistance from just like 2 hours of sitting, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, for sure. And not only that, it's a good segue, because another one that shocked me, I mean, I understand it's not shocking, but it's shocking of how impactful it can be. And that was a study which showed one night of poor sleep did the same thing, basically decreased insulin sensitivity and increased blood insulin levels. I think it was by 20 to 40%, somewhere in that range. It was a huge number.
Yeah.
And, these things can have a huge impact. So yeah, absolutely. Exercise, poor sleep, which I just mentioned, has a major impact. And sleep can decrease our insulin sensitivity, leading to insulin resistance. It can change our microbiome. Then there's other more, psychological factors, like when we're fatigued, we tend to not eat as well and we tend to exercise less. And our behaviors aren't as maybe ideal as we would want them to be, or they might be if we're well rested. There's gut dysbiosis, which is a huge issue. There's obesogenic guts and diabetes-inducing guts, where they've actually been able to replace the microorganisms, the microbiome of thin people and make them fat, and fat people and make them thin. With the change in microbiome. So or at least mice. I'm not sure. I think they did repeat it in people too. So it's
there's been some mixed data in humans.
There's been mixed data. Yeah, it's not. This isn't clear science.
But
it's interesting.
There's definitely like enough research to show that the microbiome matters into whether it can be obesogenic and diabetogenic. But to your point, I think like some of the data is like, well, no, it didn't fully make someone obese just through the microbiome, which is like, of course, like, did we really think that it was just the bugs in the gut that was the entire cause of obesity? Like, that's a lot to ask to replicate studies like that. Yeah,
for sure. And, a lot of these things lead to changes in dietary patterns. So, when you have different gut bugs, you might crave different foods and eat differently when you don't sleep as well. Same thing when you don't exercise. Same thing. So a lot of these sort of what I'm calling underlying root causes oftentimes change your dietary patterns too, which is obviously a big one. And I'll mention one more. I mean, there's hormone imbalance, there's chronic infections, which can drive stress. There's adrenal dysfunction, all kinds of things that can affect our blood sugar. But another big one is mitochondrial dysfunction. And there's been several studies on the connection between mitochondria and blood sugar and diabetes. So we know that ATP, for example, is necessary to release insulin from the beta cells of the pancreas. And ATP is actually the signal that tells the beta cells to release insulin when there's a glucose level rise in the blood. So when we don't have adequate supply of ATP, we don't get proper insulin signaling. And it's also mitochondrial dysfunction has been associated with insulin resistance again. So there's a lot of different connections here. And, this is one of the reasons why I get sort of frustrated when I hear people talking about diabetes in such simple terms like, oh, if you would just, stop eating sugar and start exercising, diabetes would go away. Certainly in some people that's the case, but oftentimes there are other underlying factors that we have to look at.